and people are, and that is also a concerning trend.
Dr. Carpenter, Dr. Carpenter, is there a sense of which toxins are doing the most damage? Do we know what it is that's hurting people?
Well, that's a very good question, and the answer is a little complicated. We know a lot about the endocrine activities of some of the persistent chemicals like PCBs and dioxins. And the reason we know a lot about them is we can take a blood sample and get some indication of what someone was exposed to numbers of years ago. But these chemicals do interfere with hormones, though many of them mimic the female sex hormone estrogen. Some mimic the male sex hormone, and some alter the rates of metabolism of those. But I think the recent concern focuses on many new chemicals that are not persistent. These are things that are in our personal care, our shampoos. They line the food cans. They're in composite dental fillings. They're everywhere. And almost all of us are exposed to them almost every day. Now, these don't stay in our bodies very long, but because we're exposed to them continuously, there's every likelihood that they also alter our endocrine systems, and that they then contribute to all of the things that Tracy's mentioned. They contribute to birth defects, because the development of the male and the female reproductive systems during gestation is determined by the balance between the female hormones and the male hormones. There now is very clear evidence that even sort of the sex-specific behaviors are influenced by exposure to chemicals. In other words, little boys exposed before birth to excessive estrogen chemicals that mimic the sex hormone estrogen, they prefer to play with dolls than guns. Now, some people may say, well, that's good, but it isn't normal. And therefore, it appears that these chemicals that alter endocrine systems affect just about every aspect of human physiology and behavior, and they clearly the risk of diseases that appear in older age, because obviously diabetes is a disease which is an abnormality of an endocrine system, that being insulin.
So can you tell me, how long does it take for the health impact of these chemicals to manifest themselves in somebody? Are we talking, that is this something that takes sometimes decades?
Well, I think our best understanding is that the most critical period is before birth. And if you're exposed to these endocrine disruptive chemicals before birth, then you're going to have a lifelong altered behavior. It's very interesting. There been a publication that recently appeared in a whole issue of the journal Carcinogenesis, where we looked at the effects of these chemicals, which are not known to cause cancer, but we compared some of the actions of these chemicals to those of chemicals known to cause cancer. We find many, many commonalities. Now, obviously, cancer is a disease that usually doesn't occur for many years, but these chemicals, which are basically not well regulated in our society, we don't know much about what they do when they come on the market, and they are altering diseases that occur many, many years after exposure, as well as some things that are found right away.
Dr. Woodruff, who is most vulnerable to these toxins? The unborn child, but I'm thinking about also are there certain groups in society who are more vulnerable?
Yeah, so it was an excellent point by Dr. Carpenter that during the fetal development you have these unique periods of susceptibility that are occurring that if you interfere with that can alter the course of development. Childhood is also an important time. And this was something very important pointed out by both opinions, by the U.S. group as well as the international group, is there are certain places where people live where they have more exposure to environmental chemicals because of where they live. So people who live near industrial facilities, people who live near freeways. So it tends to be people who are poor or who certain racial and ethnic groups tend to have a higher burden of some of these industrial chemicals. And that is one of the other areas that's been very intriguing in terms of thinking about the role of industrial chemicals on health. A lot of health disparities in the United States for certain diseases, so birth outcomes, cancer, infant mortality. Certain ethnic and racial groups, most often African Americans, suffer a disproportionate burden of different types of health outcomes. And could industrial chemical exposures be explaining a portion of that health disparity? That's an area where I think we are going to see a more active focus. That being said, people who live in these communities, they're very concerned about their chemical exposures now, and they want to see something happening in terms of addressing them.
So is this a relatively recent problem, or are we just now seeing the results of toxins that have been in the environment for decades?
I would say that our recognition of the problem has been growing. I think people have been concerned about industrial chemicals for I think there's been a concern kind of proceeding all the way from the 70s. Certainly, there was concern back in the 70s when they passed the original Toxic Substance Act, as well as other important pieces of environmental legislation. But the idea that chemicals are in these many different types of products that people go and you buy in the store, and that they're not regulated by the government, I think there's a new recognition of that. And I think a lot of that has been driven by what we've seen, a change in technology around our ability to measure these chemicals in biological samples, basically called biomonitoring, which I think maybe Dr. Carpenter mentioned, which is now we have this ability to take people's blood or urine and measure, dozens, sometimes hundreds of different industrial chemicals that could be present in people's bodies. I think the thing that's most shocking is people didn't realize how many of these chemicals are actually present in people's bodies. I think people think of their products as outside of themselves. Really, what's in there is getting inside.
Mm-hmm. We're talking this hour about chemical toxins in the